Tonight's speaker, Dr. Holly Ordway, is the author of Not God's Type. An atheist academic lays down her arms and is professor of English and director of the MA in Apologetics at Houston Baptist University, where she teaches cultural and imaginative apologetics, including creative writing, in a mere Christian setting. She holds a PhD in English literature from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Her academic work focuses on imaginative apologetics and on the writings of C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, and Charles Williams. She is the Charles Williams subject editor for the Journal of Inkling Studies, and she's currently working on a book on Tolkien and his modern sources. Presenting tonight's topic, C.S. Lewis as an integrated apologist, please welcome Dr. Holly Ordway.
Well, thank you. And am I on? Yes, I am on. All right. Very good. Well, thank you so much for being here. It's a real pleasure to be part of this and to talk about C.S. Lewis. And that word integration is a really important one, as you can see, as I hope you will see in the rest of my talk. So C.S. Lewis as an integrated apologist. So C.S. Lewis, the author most famously of Mere Christianity and the Chronicles of Narnia, died on the same day as John F. Kennedy. Overshadowed by others of greater fame in the moment of his death, he might likewise have slipped quietly into the ranks of Christian apologists who did good work in their day, but who then passed the torch to the next generation and fade into the world of out-of-print books and minor academic interest. But he did not do so. Rather, Lewis's star has continued to rise. He can now be reckoned as having joined the constellation of the greats. Why? Well, after November 22nd, 2013, one possible answer to that question has, as Shakespeare put it, a local habitation and a name. On that date, the 50th anniversary of Lewis's death, a memorial was unveiled in Poets' Corner of Westminster Abbey in London, placing Lewis in the company of Shakespeare, Chaucer, Dickens, Austen, and many other great literary men and women. It's possibly the greatest tribute that the British people can give to one of their own. Lewis joined the greats because of his contribution to English letters. And in that phrase is summed up all of his varied work as an apologist, a scholar, and a writer. I would venture to suggest that this single memorial, standing for all of Lewis's work, suggests a certain unity about that work. Lewis was a thoroughly integrated man, and this integration, this sense of wholeness, is a crucial element in his lasting and extensive impact. I'm going to talk about Lewis as an imaginative apologist, Lewis as a literary critic, and Lewis as a creative writer, all of which will help us see what makes him so special as an apologist, and perhaps most importantly, will help us to apply this secret of his success to our own work as apologists and evangelists, and as ordinary Christians seeking to be a witness in the world. Now, Lewis's wholeness was hard won. He wrote, "Nearly all that I loved, I believed to be imaginary. Nearly all that I believed to be real, I thought grim and meaningless." Such was Lewis's condition as a young man and an atheist. "The two hemispheres of my mind," he wrote in his autobiography, "were in the sharpest contrast." His conversion to Christianity involved a reunion of these divided hemispheres, such that he could see Christ's incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection as a true myth. When he became a Christian, his first instinct was to give an account of his philosophical journey from atheism to faith, but to place that journey in imaginative terms. The Pilgrim's Regress is one of the less well-known of Lewis's books, though it's probably read at least slightly more often than, for instance, his English literature in the 16th century, excluding drama. Nonetheless, The Pilgrim's Regress marks a significant moment in his life, and it represents an important experiment for Lewis as he began his apologetics writing. The Pilgrim's Regress is an allegorical account of a young man, John, who has a glimpse of a beautiful island that evokes a deep longing in him, and who goes on a quest to find this island. In the process, goes through different territories and meets different characters who represent the various philosophical views that Lewis considered and rejected as he sought and then found the true main road that led to his Christian faith. Lewis wrote The Pilgrim's Regress very rapidly, in just a few weeks following his conversion. It might seem strange that he would write a story, an allegory, and a very imaginatively vivid one, rather than a philosophical statement of belief or a personal narrative. But here we can already see the first fruits of that integrated vision that would eventually undergird all of Lewis's apologetics writing. Writing 10 years later, Lewis explained his choice of allegory as a genre. All good allegory exists not to hide, but to reveal, to make the inner world more palpable by giving it an imagined, concrete embodiment. Now, The Pilgrim's Regress failed to achieve what Lewis hoped. It's so densely packed with meaning that, frankly, it's difficult to understand. In fact, Lewis ended up writing extensive annotations to it in a copy for one of his students to provide a key to explain the various quite obscure allegorical connections. Lewis wrote later, "My allegory failed, partly through my own fault, and partly because modern readers are unfamiliar with the method." And by the way, for those who are curious, you can now get a copy of The Pilgrim's Regress with Lewis's annotations in the Wade annotated edition. After this experience, Lewis never returned to writing direct allegory because he discovered that it was the embodiments of the ideas and story, not the intellectual puzzle of the allegory form, that conveyed truth in the deep, effective way that he sought. But in the process of writing The Pilgrim's Regress, and then considering what he had written, he made an important realization about the workings of the imagination and its capacity to communicate truth. He writes that it remains true that wherever the symbols are best, the key is least adequate. For when allegory is at its best, it approaches myth, which must be grasped with the imagination, not with the intellect. Lewis had discovered that not only could he appreciate imaginative literature as a way of knowing, a way of grasping the truth himself, but he could create it, and he could incorporate this into his direct apologetics work, as well as into his fiction and his poetry. For all the rest of his life, Lewis's work would remind us that to look at something and to look along it are both ways of knowing, as he put it in his great essay, Meditation in a Toolshed. Our culture tends to privilege the analytical, detached viewpoint, looking at something, as if this were the only way to know anything. And it's extreme. This is the viewpoint that says that if you can't measure it, or you can't account for it scientifically, it doesn't really exist. Lewis writes that it has even come to be taken for granted that the external account of a thing somehow refutes or debunks the account given from the inside. But in fact, some things cannot be understood solely at the analytical level, like falling in love. As Lewis puts it, a young man meets a girl. The whole world looks different when he sees her. Her voice reminds him of something he's been trying to remember all his life. And 10 minutes casual chat with her is more precious than all the favors that all other women in the world could grant. He is, as they say, in love. Now comes a scientist and describes this young man's experience from the outside. For him, it is all an affair of the young man's genes and a recognized biological stimulus. That is the difference between looking along the sexual impulse and looking at it. Now, in our present day, the scientists, the empiricists, have indeed had it all their own way. But Lewis helps us to recover this view of looking along the beam. Indeed, one of the major achievements of Lewis is his recovery of the use of imagination as a mode of knowing, without thereby rejecting or dismissing the role of reason. Lewis is a rigorous thinker. It's worth remembering that his early training was in philosophy, and indeed he originally intended to pursue an academic position as a philosopher. Yet, if we ask whether any of Lewis's straight apologetics works would be as effective as they are if they were stripped of their imagery, the stories boiled down to their propositional bones, I suspect that the answer would probably be no, they're not. Lewis is effective as an apologist because in all his works, he's concerned not simply with truth, but also with meaning. It's not sufficient merely to present an idea cold and dead on a platter for the skeptic to sniff at and then walk away. The idea must be brought to life. Consider his extended discussion of faith in Mere Christianity. He sets out to explain how faith differs from belief and how faith can be considered a virtue, noting that he once assumed that the human mind is completely ruled by reason. If that were the case, then faith and belief would be the same thing. But in fact, this assumption is not true. He writes, for example, my reason is perfectly convinced by good evidence that anesthetics do not smother me and that properly trained surgeons do not start operating until I am unconscious. But that does not alter the fact that when they have me down on the table and clap their horrible mask over my face, a mere childish panic begins inside me. I start thinking that I am going to choke, and I am afraid they will start cutting me up before I am properly under. In other words, I lose my faith in anesthetics. Lewis then sums up his argument with precise language. It is not reason that is taking away my faith. On the contrary, my faith is based on reason. It is my imagination and emotions. The battle is between faith and reason on one side and emotion and imagination on the other. It's a clearly stated, powerful point, but it has its punch precisely because he has illustrated it so vividly beforehand. Here we have a glimpse, a hint of Lewis's depth and staying power, why he continues to be unsurpassed as a popular apologist. As Austin Farrer put it with reference to Lewis's book, The Problem of Pain, we think we are listening to an argument. In fact, we are presented with a vision, and it is the vision that carries conviction. Everything that Lewis wrote was infused with imaginative insight and thus infused with meaning. And he knew what he was doing. Reason, he wrote, is the natural organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning. reason makes judgments about truth and falsehood. But in order to do that, it must have something to reason about. Imagination provides the meaningful ideas and images upon which reason can then work. Imagination is truly fundamental to reason. Now, as famous as Lewis became on the basis of his apologetics works, nonetheless, he always and rightly described himself as an amateur theologian. It's easy, especially for Americans, to forget that for 30 years, from 1924 to 1954, his day-to-day work was tutoring students, giving lectures, and producing academic literary criticism. Now, we might think, perhaps, that if he hadn't been an Oxford Don, he'd have had more time to produce great works of apologetics. However, the more closely one looks at his academic work, the more significant it becomes as the foundation and fount of inspiration for his apologetics work. His academic work reflected and refined his reading and his writing, disciplining it, sharpening his sensitivity to genre, mood, and word choice. In his important academic work, Studies in Words, Lewis shows a keen attention to language, its nuances, its flavors, its change over time. He traces the way that a word like nature, or free, or even world has different meanings, and meanings that change over time. And he shows how significantly this shift in meaning affects the reader's understanding of an author's arguments. The attentiveness to language that Lewis honed in his academic work bears fruit in much of his apologetics works, from his discussion of the different meanings of the word love in The Four Loves, to his deliberate choice to use the word Tao to refer to the objective moral code in The Abolition of Man. Perhaps most importantly, all his life, Lewis was an avid reader, something that certainly stimulated his imagination and involved him in vigorous intellectual debate, and in so doing helped equip him for both popular apologetics and academic work. As a young man, sometimes he seemed almost drunk with literature, carried away by his imaginative engagement in the story or atmosphere of the work. He never lost that capacity for enjoyment, and indeed, this is what sets him apart from many, perhaps most, academic literary critics today, his love of what he read. Throughout all of Lewis's books and essays, we can see his attention to meaning and his willingness to surrender to the experience of reading, something he writes about explicitly in his book An Experiment in Criticism. Lewis, the literary critic, enters into the world of the text, whether it's the medieval world of the Roman de la Rose or the science fictional world of H.G. Wells, and he first meets with what he finds there on its own terms. And so, in his approach to reading, we can also catch a glimpse of what makes Lewis such a gifted teacher, his genuine love of the subject and enjoyment of reading as an experience. And just as Lewis's approach to reading sustained and nourished both his academic and popular work, so too his approach to communication was the same at its core. When Lewis gave his wartime talks on Christianity, that later became the book Mere Christianity, he discovered that it was necessary to be able to explain theology in terms that his lay audience would understand, and that this was far more difficult to do than it seemed. He did the necessary work, and he learned how to communicate to a broader audience with both depth and rigor. I suspect that his ability to make this shift, to discern his audience's level of understanding and adapt his approach to suit, without abandoning the content, was not something he discovered on the fly, but rather it was rooted in the quality of his academic writing. His imaginative vision and his rational thinking allowed him to express his insights in ways that are both precise and imaginatively powerful. Consider, for instance, the opening image of his book, A Preface to Paradise Lost, a brilliant illustration of the necessity of understanding literary genre. Lewis writes, "The first qualification for judging any piece of workmanship, from a corkscrew to a cathedral, is to know what it is, what it was intended to do, and how it is meant to be used." After that has been discovered, the temperance reformer may decide that the corkscrew was made for a bad purpose, and the communist may think the same about the cathedral. But such questions come later. The first thing is to understand the object before you. As long as you think the corkscrew was meant for opening tins, or the cathedral for entertaining tourists, you can say nothing to the purpose about them. Lewis's point here is, as he says, the first thing that the reader needs to know about Paradise Lost is what Milton meant it to be. But so clear is the insight, and so vivid is the illustration, that this illustration of the corkscrew and the cathedral is equally applicable to the understanding of any text whatsoever. Lewis's integration of imagination and reason, his use of image and metaphor to convey meaning, his love and attention to language, his deep immersion in literature, these all come together in his creative work as a poet and as a novelist. Now, it may seem surprising to first mention Lewis as a poet, but in fact, his first sense of literary identity and his first two published works were in poetry. Now, he did not get the success that he hoped for as a poet, and as his letters to his friend Arthur Greeves show, he consciously and painfully let go of his poetic ambitions. Yet there are two things to note here. One is that although Lewis's fame is rightly founded on his prose works, he's a better poet than most people realize. His poems, many of them unpublished at his death, were gathered by Walter Hooper into two collections, poems and narrative poems, and not surprisingly, given contemporary lack of enthusiasm for poetry in general, have been largely overlooked by readers. But his poetry does have merit. In the poems, we find phrases full of imaginative richness, compact and vivid. This year, the summer will come true. Devils are unmaking language. Heaven's hermitage, high and lonely. More significant than his imagery is the sound of his poetry. This is actually one of the reasons that Lewis's poetry is difficult to quote, for the effect is unfashionably tightly bound up with the form and metrical structure of the whole poem. But it seems likely to me that his attention to sound and rhythm in his poetry disciplined him to do the same in his prose, but with a freer hand and a larger canvas. Here we encounter a man who knew language intimately, who tasted it, who worked with the rhythm of a line, shaping it until it sang. I would submit that it is from his lifelong attention to writing poetry that Lewis was able to write prose that resonates the way it does, with lines like the brilliant close of the essay, Is Theology Poetry?, which are now engraved on the memorial stone in Poets' Corner of Westminster Abbey, and very fittingly. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen. not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. What a line. If anything of Lewis's work survives when all the rest has passed away, it will almost certainly be the Chronicles of Narnia. And here we see Lewis at his most integrated as apologist, scholar, and writer. The Narnia books are not a retreat from engagement with apologetics, but a new way to approach it, using imaginative strategies to present a view of the same objective truth that Lewis so powerfully defends in his straight apologetics works. Yet there's something special about the Chronicles of Narnia, something that has proved impossible for later Christian authors to replicate. Only Lewis's friend and fellow inkling J.R.R. Tolkien has managed, in The Lord of the Rings, to create a work of equal power and appeal that also conveys the Christian vision. No one since Lewis and Tolkien has achieved this, though the shelves are crammed full of imitations, showing that many have tried. The deftness of Lewis's word choice, the elegance and clarity of his prose, the consistent yet subtle patterning of his images throughout the novels show the hand of Lewis the poet, attentive to the play of language. These are extremely well-written books, apart from any other consideration. And yet, there are plenty of good novels in the world. There's something distinctive about the Chronicles of Narnia that has made them particularly compelling for so many readers. So what is it that gives the Chronicles of Narnia its resonance and power? In his magisterial book, Planet Narnia, Michael Ward has made a convincing case for this answer, that the Chronicles are constructed out of and deeply imbued with the spiritual symbolism of the medieval seven heavens. And thus we see that Lewis, the literary critic, laid the foundations for Narnia. For Lewis didn't just stumble across an interesting bit of information about medieval cosmology and decide to include it in his writing. Rather, he had been writing and teaching and thinking about medieval literature for his entire professional career as an academic. He fully understood and had imaginatively engaged with the imagery of the medieval cosmos. He knew from his reading and from his poetry and from his academic analysis that these planets were genuinely spiritual symbols of permanent value. And Lewis, the imaginative apologist, built on those foundations. The Narnia Chronicles are all about Christ. That's Lewis's phrase. Presented not didactically and not allegorically, but through a technique that Michael Ward has named Donegality, with its invented etymology connecting to the spirit of Donegal, the Irish coast with the glorious jovial waves that Lewis loved so much. Donegality, as Ward explains in Planet Narnia, involves the deliberate creation of a distinctive atmosphere or flavor for each book that subtly crystallizes in a Christological character. The Christ of the Narnia books is the cosmic Christ implicit in every aspect of reality. Aslan is the Christ figure in which the atmosphere each book is focused. We breathe in the kingly spirit of Christ in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. We are braced by his martial spirit in Prince Caspian, and so on throughout the Chronicles, with each book having a distinctive atmosphere that shows forth a different aspect of the one by whom all things were made. Such an atmosphere could only have been created by a man who thoroughly understood the experience of reading, someone who could taste the flavor of a novel like James Fenimore Cooper's The Last of the Mohicans, or the unspoken holiness of George MacDonald's Phantastes. Someone who understood from inside, as a lifelong reader of great sensitivity, how a work of fiction operates in the imagination. And the Christological focus of the Chronicles, which is the source of their power and meaning. For Christ is not an add-on moral to the Chronicles, but the very center and heart, the love that moves the Narnian sun and other stars. This focus could only have been created by a man whose faith was part of every aspect of his daily life. And so we come to the heart of Lewis as an integrated apologist. His apologetics work involved both imagination and reason. It drew on his knowledge of philosophy and theology, and also his deep knowledge of English literature. It was both analytical and creative. All these elements contribute to the secret of Lewis's success. But just as the secret of the Narnia Chronicles is in its Christ-centeredness, expressed in a different, distinctive way in each book, so too the secret of Lewis's life is his Christ-centeredness. The fact that his faith was indeed part of every aspect of his life. And here we can see most clearly the way that Lewis can be a model for us. He did not compartmentalize his life as a Christian, even though he worked in a secular environment at a secular university, teaching both Christians and non-Christians. Rather, his understanding of the world as a Christian and his commitment to love God and love his neighbor were expressed in and through his teaching and his academic writing just as much as through his personal friendships and his apologetics writing. And Lewis did not compartmentalize his work. He brought his gifts of clear and rigorous thinking, attention to language, and imaginative power to bear on all of his writing, whether it was academic literary criticism, fiction, or apologetics. This integration of himself and of his work is a major part of why Lewis is such a great writer and such an effective apologist. And so we can ask ourselves, how can I become more whole? How can my life more fully express my faith in day-to-day life? How can I make connections between the different things that I'm learning and studying so that they're not just isolated assignments I have to do and then probably forget, or just required classes on a transcript, but part of the material that I'm drawing on to do good work as God has called me to do? How can I practice the skills of thinking both clearly and imaginatively in all that I do so that it becomes second nature? For Lewis, Christ is above all, and in all, and through all. And in the end, this is what gives Lewis an integrated vision. For indeed, as his friend and literary executor Walter Hooper put it, Lewis was a thoroughly converted man. Thank you.
The way Q&A works, I just simply ask that you ask a question. I don't want to hear a 15-minute diatribe. If you have that much to say, contact me about speaking at your own BBC. Try and have your question 2 minutes or less. Keep it germane to the topic, please. And yeah, I'll start since I'm up here. Reading in your book, you have a very lengthy list of what you grew up reading. You read Little House on the Prairie, and yet you're not living in a log cabin somewhere chasing wild animals. But Lewis was the one that his writings, there was a residual impact that stayed and continued to impact you and affect you. Can you speak to why?
Yes, that's a great question. Because I read, as I noted, voraciously as a girl, and I still do. So what was it that made Lewis, and not just Lewis, but Tolkien, because the Chronicles of Narnia and the Lord of the Rings were really the books that changed my life really dramatically, and I think the Lord of the Rings even more so than the Chronicles of Narnia. And I think what made those books different is, and this is looking back and trying to understand how they impacted me, from much later on. Both Lewis and Tolkien gave me a vision of the world seen in the light of Christ. And that meant that their picture of the world was complex. It had both goodness and evil, and it had both great beauty, and it had pain and suffering and sorrow. And yet everything cohered. It was a world in which these things made sense. And above all, in The Lord of the Rings, there is a sense, good wins. There is evil does not have the last word, but it's not without a cost. There's real suffering and real brokenness. Frodo saves Middle-earth, but he himself does not feel the fruits of that. He's not able to enjoy it. He has to accept the sacrifice for the good of others, and he goes off, and at the end of the book, still wounded. And so I think what both Lewis and Tolkien gave me was a glimpse of the world the way it really is, because we do live in a world that was originally made by God, and he looked at the world and he called it very good. The world is beautiful because God made it, but it's a world that's broken because we broke it. And so brokenness is real as well. And that's something that no other authors, other than the great Christian authors, Lewis, Tolkien, and then later on Gerard Manley Hopkins was a poet who really spoke to me in that light. This was something that they were able to communicate to me, this vision of a world that actually made sense, because the Hallmark card TV special Christianity, which is what I really saw as a kid growing up. I didn't have really any experience of robust Christianity. This idea of, it was just sort of warm fuzzies and buddy Jesus, and there's no oomph to it. There's no ability to deal with the real brokenness and pain of the world. It just seems kind of sappy and sentimental and fake and kind of whatever. It's not real. But on the other hand, the atheist view of the world, which I read, and I read authors like Harlan Ellison, I was really into when I was a teenager, really got that the world's broken and there's injustice and pain and this is wrong. But they didn't have anything that they could do about it, really, other than rage at it. Now, raging at injustice, this is a good reaction. You want to be able to call out injustice and say, this is wrong. But what this point of view isn't able to say is, how do we know what's right? We have to have a sense of goodness to know when something's wrong. That's why when, the tragedy of a child dying is such a tragedy, because we know in our hearts that you're not meant to die young. You're supposed to have your full life. So that's why it's a tragedy, because we have a picture of what it's supposed to be. So the atheist recognition of brokenness didn't have all the pieces in it. And that's what Lewis and Tolkien gave me, was a vision of wholeness. Because the Chronicles of Narnia, they're complex books. They are not just happy, everything goes fine. There's pain, there's suffering in there. The Voyage of the Dawn Treader is my favorite of the Narnia Chronicles. And Eustace's de-dragoning is such a great scene. The whole character of Eustace in there is just great. So that, I think, is what stuck with me, this roundedness of the vision. And, of course, at the time when I read these books, I had no idea. But the great thing about truth is that it's true whether you recognize this truth or not. So I had a vision of the world as it really is, given to me as a child, before I knew what it was that I was seeing, and it stuck with me. So yeah, that's...
Yeah.
It's working.
Thank you so much for coming to do this. This is great. I am have been intrigued by Lewis's notion of the true myth and that concept. And I can't hear the word myth without thinking of Joseph Campbell and his view of mythology. And I'll confess, even as a believer, I like Joseph Campbell. But one of the things that's always confounded me about him and his approach is, obviously, in his view of myth, the myths don't have to be true in order to have meaning. I wonder how C.S. Lewis would respond to that. Obviously, speaking of Christianity as a true myth, he's finding reality in the story and anchoring it in reality. At the same time, I think even in that, at least one of the quotes that he has about the true myth, he also expresses that there can be meaning and truth in the pagan myths, in non-true myths. So I wonder if you could respond. I should probably say too here, I'm in the process of writing a paper in the program I'm in, so my mind is on this topic about something sort of related, but not entirely. But looking at Lewis as an advocate for fiction as a way to express theological truth, how would he combat that, or how would he agree with Campbell's view of myth there?
Right. Well, welcome to like the entire world of my apologetics work. So let me attempt to boil down this into a relatively concise answer. Great question. So first, let me take a step back and say one of the things we need to do along the lines of the way Lewis thought is to distinguish what we mean by the word myth. That's really important because the word myth has different meanings. There's a very, and this confuses people to no end. There's a very common meaning of myth, which is something that's false, like 7 myths about your car insurance, or whatever, the typical clickbait title. And that's one meaning of the word myth. That is not the meaning of the word myth as Lewis and Tolkien use it. You probably know that, but I'm just sort of saying this as a general sort of prologue. Myth, as Lewis uses the term, he uses it in the literary critical sense, which is to say a story of great resonance that conveys something meaningful. So that's what Joseph Campbell's all about, the myth of the hero's journey. It's a story of great resonance because then we can look at that and we can say, I too feel how my life is a journey. And we can recognize so many powerful, heroic journeys from the Odyssey and Odysseus trying to make his way home, the Aeneid, which is Virgil's retelling of that, to the Lord of the Rings. That's the hero's journey, all right. So here, the whole point of a myth of that kind is that the myth does not make any pretension at factual nature. That's not the kind of thing that it is. So, the story of Odysseus journeying home, now the Trojan War, we now know, was a real event. But actually, a few hundred years ago, everybody thought, until Heinrich Schliemann dug up Troy, they thought that it was totally fiction, that Homer just made it all up. And then Heinrich Schliemann went and dug up Troy, and they said, oh, whoops, there really was a Troy. But the journey of Odysseus is made up. And nobody needs it to be, no one's claiming that Odysseus really even existed or went to all these different islands and whatnot. But the story has mythic resonance in the sense of trying to find his way home. And in many ways, although the Odyssey is deeply pagan and in many ways fundamentally antithetical to the Christian worldview in some important ways, as my students were learning we were reading this in my ancient philosophy and culture class this semester. Nonetheless, that mythic arc has truth in it because we are all on a journey home to our Father's house, right? So the Odyssey as a myth is a true myth in a certain sense because it tells us something true that we are lost and that we are trying to find our way home, and that the journey is difficult and that we must have courage and fortitude and all that. That's the kind of thing that Joseph Campbell, I think, is getting at, and that's, for instance, why Star Wars, which draws on Joseph Campbell's work, is such a great set of films. Not the prequels. Yeah. But the classic ones, right? Because it's drawing on a fundamental story that at a deep level is true. So I think when we talk about there being truth in pagan myths, that's the kind of truth that we as Christians can talk about. So for instance, this is something that Lewis talks about, this idea of the dying and the rising God. Now, there are two ways to deal with the claim that Christ is nothing but, another version of Dionysius. Because on the one hand, if you look actually at the specific claims, it's bosh. It doesn't map. It just doesn't work. But if you look at it from the mythic standpoint, the idea of a dying God who in his rising again somehow revitalizes the earth, well, it does show that there is some meaning to the cycle of the seasons, which God made. God made the cycle of seasons. He didn't have to do it that way. And so this dying in winter and reviving in the spring, not that there's a whole lot of that in Houston, but you can see it in pictures, National Geographic. So we actually have an image built into nature itself that the pagans recognized, that we do die, and yet somehow there's new life that comes out of death. And this, I would argue, is actually a backwards echo of what Christ did on the cross. Because since Christ's death and resurrection is the pivot point of history, of all history, not just of human history, but of the history of the cosmos, well, it makes sense. God is not bound by time. It makes sense to me that it would have echoes backwards as well as forwards. So, well, yeah, the pagan myths have some echoes of that, and they're insofar as they recognize that there is such a thing as rebirth, dimly, very dimly. Well, that's right, that's true. So then coming to what Lewis is saying about the true myth, and Tolkien makes this point even more strongly, well, not more strongly, but equally strongly. The whole fascinating thing, and this is actually what Tolkien helped Lewis to understand, because Tolkien had a really big hand in helping Lewis become a Christian. The story of Christ is a mythic story. It has all the resonance of myth. It's a great story. And it actually happened in history. It's a myth that actually happened. That's what makes it a true myth in Lewis's sense. So now we can distinguish, there's true in the sense of it resonates with universal sort of basic truths, but it's also, the story of Christ is also true historically. So that's a very long answer to your question, but it's...
Real quick,
Yeah.
as you were talking, one of the things that hit me is, can you identify any other, and you sort of answered this, any other true myths that are anywhere near the scale of the crucifixion, resurrection, Socrates and the hemlock, or, I'm stuck on martyrdom, Polycarp, or something. Is there anything else?
Well, Polycarp's historical.
Historical, right? That's what I'm saying.
Christian.
That's what I'm saying, right? That's historical. That's a true myth that it rises to the same level of mythic story as Tolkien would.
Well, that's actually that's a great point. Nothing that rises to the same story, the same level, because nothing can rise to the same level as the impact of that. But I think this is useful to keep in mind that historical events are also mythic, or can be mythic in their significance. And I think that the great example would be the events of the Old Testament. Because, for instance, the Exodus, this is something that actually happened. This is a historical event. But because God is the author of history, he can write history in ways that are really, allegorical as well. So you get later Christian authors rightly being able to say that the Exodus is allegorical, that it's symbolic of our baptism, our going from death into life. It's really important to emphasize to say that the Exodus is symbolic is not to say that it's only symbolic, right? Let's not be either or. This is both and territory. The Exodus happened. It's a historical event. It is also symbolic. In the same way, the Transfiguration, that is an event that really happened. Jesus really did become transfigured in the sight of his disciples. But it's also richly imbued with symbolism about our prayer life and the way that we, respond to God. Both and so that's what I would say to that.
We have a very large live stream audience watching.
Hello.
And they're submitting questions. If you're here and you don't want to get up here, you can send a question to questions@thebibleamerconsortium.com. They'll pop up here. I will read them. Richard wrote, "Thank you for the great lecture. Could you please elaborate further on this point? Lewis said he did not lose faith in anesthesia because of his reason."
That's the question.
That's the question. If you could just elaborate on that.
Right. This is an illustration from Mere Christianity, where Lewis is writing about the fact that he's scared of going to the dentist. I'm scared of going to the dentist. Going to the dentist is scary. So his point is that, well, he's asking basically, why is he afraid when he sits down at the dentist and he's going to have a tooth extracted? In his reason, he knows how anesthesia works, and he knows the evidence. He knows that the doctor is not going to start yanking his teeth out before he's applied the anesthesia. That's not why he's afraid. It's not that his reason has given him new arguments. Oh, wait, I've just read a study that showed that half of patients are cut up before they're actually under. No. He doesn't have any new evidence or any reasons to doubt the anesthesia is going to work. It's that he's scared. It's his emotions are overcoming his reason, and that's what's causing him to lose his faith in the anesthesia. So it's a case of basically emotional doubt. He doesn't have any different information. His reason still says the same thing, but he's doubting because of his emotions. And actually, it's because he's able to recognize that he's able to say, okay, I'm scared, but I'm going to have the dental work done anyway, because I know that this is my emotions and not my reason that's telling me this. And I think this is actually quite significant with regard to apologetics, because there are different kinds of doubts. And Christians are often really afraid of acknowledging doubt. Like they think that it's a disease, it's catching or something, or that if you admit it, that it'll eat you up. Well, it's actually the opposite. Emotions that lead to doubt, or the kind of emotions that are associated with doubt, get worse if they're not addressed, not better. And if you have a doubt, you need to address it. You need to either figure out, what's my question? Is it an intellectual doubt, in which case, go find the answer, ask somebody, ask your local HBU-trained apologist. We're doing our bit to get people out there. So there's intellectual doubts that you need to recognize it so that you can get the answer. And that's why it's a really horrible thing that so many young people get told, don't ask those questions. Because that's the surefire way, guarantee that will fester and the doubt will get worse. No, say, and if you don't know the answer, you know what you say? You say, I don't know the answer, but I will help you find someone who does. And I'll tell you, sideline on that, we really need not be afraid of saying, I don't know. Among other things, if we know lots of things and we're able to speak confidently about those things, when we get to a question and somebody asks you that question and they say, and you say, well, I don't know, there's two things going on there. One is you actually just boosted your credibility for all the things that you do know the answer for, because all of a sudden, your person that you're talking to realizes, oh, she's not BSing me. If she knows, she'll say it, and if she doesn't, she'll say it. Wow, so if she gives me an answer, I can rely on it. This is tremendously reassuring. And then it means that we also have credibility as human beings, that we want to help. We're not just going to blow smoke at people. And trust me, I've been teaching for many years. Students, and the same thing goes for anybody, they know when you're BSing them. You know, people are not stupid. If they see that you're just kind of winging it, you know, just sort of making stuff up, what the conclusion you're going to draw is, well, they don't know anything. This is all a bunch of hooey. So just an honest, I don't know. But hopefully, and even just a straight up, I don't know is okay. But say, I don't know, but let me see if I can find somebody who does, is great. So that's the intellectual doubt. But then the thing that Lewis is getting at in this thing with the dentist is emotional doubt. That's a different thing. Emotional doubt comes, I mean, we're emotional people. God made us that way. Emotions are good. But they can get out of hand, just like we can become too cerebral, we can become too emotional, and the emotion can get out of hand. So we have to ask ourselves, if we're doubting, is it perhaps because we're under a lot of stress about something? And I think as apologists, we have to be really attentive to what kind of doubt people have. So if somebody says, this is the biggie, if somebody says, I'm not sure I can believe in God because of the problem of evil. Now, everybody, please stop, do not pass go, do not collect $200 until you find out what is the source of that question. Because if the person has just read an article or a blog post from some atheist that giving an intellectual argument about this, then you address the intellectual argument. You say, well, let's talk about that. But you ask a little bit more and you say, oh, your mother was just diagnosed with cancer. Well, then what you do is you say, I'm really sorry. You say, how can I help you? Your mother just died of cancer. Let me mourn with you. Let me support you. Let me comfort you. And let me pray with you. Let me pray for you. But we'll talk about the intellectual issues another time, because that's not what's going on right now. Different questions call for different answers.
Dr. Ordway, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
I apologize for the general nature of this question. If Lewis were alive today, would his advice, generally speaking, have changed for the modern day Christian? And to make a finer point from Brad, who just asked a question, is his approach in any way related to his time period?
Yes and no. How's that for an answer? Okay, I will now, of course, elaborate. Fundamentally, Lewis's approach to apologetics is every bit as valid now as it was in his day. And that's actually, his work is a really major undergirding factor in the apologetics program that I teach at. I mean, we do a lot of Lewis. And that's for a good reason, because he articulates the interrelationship of reason and imagination in a way that's just, he just gets it. He just nails it. I mean, it's just, that's not going to change. He's also really, really spot on in his analysis of language. And I noticed Studies in Words. Studies in Words is a really important book. I teach it in my apologetics classes. Studies in Words, he's looking at meaning changing. Because we've got to know, well, this is a whole other talk of mine, but we have to know what do the words mean that we're talking, to people about. I mean, take the word God, for instance. I love Bishop Robert Barron, his Word on Fire ministry. Awesome. And he has a video that I've seen where he points out that sometimes he'll have an atheist will say, I don't believe in God. I don't believe in an old man up in the sky who just sends down thunderbolts to blast sinners. And Bishop Barron says, great, neither do I. So let's talk about God as the ground of all being, right? Because the word God, as you're using it, does not mean what we mean when we talk about God. And a lot of times we just talk past each other when we do. So one of the things I teach my students is to ask, what do you mean by that? Great question. What do you mean by that? So Lewis is really, that's a pivotal key insight that Lewis has for us. And then his integration of apologetics in his literary work. And that's why I really you should read Planet Narnia. It's just a great book. And there's a layman's version called the Narnia Code. Just really great insight into Lewis's imaginative apologetics in the Chronicles of Narnia. We need to understand that kind of work. So that's just fundamentally theoretically sound. Now, one of the aspects of Lewis's work, and we see this actually in his approaches in things like the Abolition of Man, Mere Christianity, he tailors his work to his audience. And that's actually one of the reasons that Mere Christianity is not going to be an effective book forever. Because Lewis never intended to be a book for all times and all places. If he had tried to do that, it wouldn't have worked for what he was doing. He was writing to his fellow British during World War II. Very specific audience. It came out of his wartime radio broadcasts for the BBC, the other BBC. So he had a very specific audience, his fellow British men and women during 1940s World War II England. That's a very specific context. His examples, his illustrations, they're tailored for that audience. They do not always work for 21st century Americans. They just don't. Now, the genius of Lewis is that they work so often, and they do work so well. But what I think, and Lewis would not, I think, have any qualms in saying, yeah, of course they're not going to work for everybody. He didn't intend them to. So he would say, I think, what is going to work for your audience, for Americans in 2016, or for British in 2016, or for Japanese in 2016, et cetera, et cetera. And I think what he does in Mere Christianity, the strategy is fundamentally absolutely sound because he infuses imagination into his apologetics. Now, most people when they read Mere Christianity think of it as a book of logical arguments, and it is. But I want you to reread it and pay attention to the imagery. It's full of images, just image after image after image after image. That's how he brings his argument home. If you took out the images, you'd have like almost nothing left, because that's how he conveys his argument. I mean, even the opening where he illustrates the point that we all agree about some kind of underlying moral code by two people squabbling, over, fairness in a train, I think his illustration is. So, well, now who rides in trains in America? I wish we had trains. Trains are awesome, but we don't really have them. So we got to find some other illustration for that. But the way that he does it, by taking an experience that anybody could have and connecting it to objective morality, so people go, oh yeah, I get it. That works. So that's the yes and no.
I have 3 questions, but maybe I can just tie
just
two
one.
together into one. I'm just going to tie 2 together into one. So, of course, I would safely assume that you think illustrations are very vital whenever we're conveying philosophical, metaphysical truths. So my question is, how could we approach perhaps coming up with our own illustrations, or what tactics, methods could we use to come up with an illustration to convey a metaphysical truth? Mm-hmm. And then there's also, I've been to some churches where I see them using almost the entire pulpit time to speak or to try, and sometimes I think it's reaching to where they're getting a secular movie and then they're trying to see Christ in the movie. Are they reaching? Is that too much? Is there a place for that? Should that be behind a pulpit or maybe in a Bible study? Or what are your opinions on that? And of course, what way can we come up with our own illustrations?
Okay, so two questions. One, the film, and one, how do we do metaphors? Let me do the film one first. I think it's really useful and important for Christians to comment on film. I think film is a major art form. It's really important. I may sound like just advertising our program, but I am. But we do talk about film. We have a film class as well. It's really important. Now, I think that sometimes it can be a stretch for a particular film to try and find these Christ connections in it. But it's worth looking. I think you can go too far in the direction of seeing Christian relevance in everything, but you can also, and this is actually I think more common, go too far in the other extreme and say unless it's explicitly Christian, it's just worthless garbage, and we shouldn't even think about it. And that's no good either. Now, I will say though, there are films that I think you should not see, just as there are books that I think you should not read, because you can't get things out of your head. Some Christians are called to the apologetics work that involves seeing things that are very difficult to see. They're kind of like firefighters. They go out. I do some of that. I try to avoid it, but I have to do some of it. Pray for those people, support them. It's a very important and dangerous ministry, but it needs to be done. But I think we need to be able to say, no, nobody should read 50 Shades of Grey or see the movie. I have not. I've previewed the book enough to know it is pornography. I have not read the whole thing through. I did not need to, and I'm not going to. I don't want that in my head. But there are many things in between that's like, okay, not all that we would want, but there's still things that are worthwhile. That said, I myself don't think that the pulpit is the right place for that. I think the pulpit should be used for discussing and explicating the scripture readings for the day. And I really think that discussing like films ought to be done in other adult education kinds of things. Save the pulpit for explicating the scripture text of the day. Now, coming back to your other question about how do we learn to do more metaphors, practice. There is no substitute for practice. Read. Read a lot. Don't just read apologetics. For the love of God, don't. Read widely. Look, I'm an apologist. I lead an apologetics program. I do apologetics. My PhD is in English literature. This helps me. This is not like a kind of weird thing. It's part of how I'm good at what I do. Now, you don't have to go and get a PhD in English to do that, but read the classics, learn to enjoy them. You have to learn. It takes time. I did not enjoy Jane Austen until I was in my 30s, right? It took time. But by the way, gentlemen, the men should read Jane Austen too. It's a great insight into the way women's minds works. It's a tip. Very helpful. So, I heard that. Yeah, I'm a professor. I hear everything. All right. So read lots of different things. Read different genres. If you normally read only philosophy, read history. If you normally read nonfiction, also read fiction. If you normally read just fiction, read nonfiction. Read all sorts of different things. This is really going to help because you will see all the different ways that you can express yourself and get practice at it. Yes, you have brought me a beer. All right, thank you. So I would say read. And I would say practice writing because really writing is a skill. Just like you wouldn't be able to expect to run a marathon after just thinking about running a marathon. You have to train for it. You have to work at it. You have to get yourself in shape. You have to keep yourself in shape. So the same thing with writing. Same thing with communication. You got to practice it.
Another question submitted online, actually from our treasurer, Gordon Rhodes. Says, thank you very much for speaking tonight. When you mentioned Tolkien, you made it sound like he wrote Lord of the Rings to express his faith, but I've always been taught that Tolkien hated allegory. Can you shed some light on this?
Absolutely, I can shed light on this. I'm writing a book on Tolkien. Tolkien's really my specialty. Two things there, and I'll take them in reverse order. Tolkien is widely quoted for saying that he had a cordial dislike of allegory. Tolkien was a curmudgeon, and he was very likely to declare something over the top, no, I hate allegory, just because he was kind of irritated at the moment by a particular allegory that he was reading. In fact, Tolkien, he was fine with allegory in its proper place. He didn't like allegory being forced onto things that are not allegorical. The Lord of the Rings is not an allegory. Okay, an allegory is a technical literary form, and the Lord of the Rings is not an example of it, nor is Narnia. Pilgrim's Regress is an allegory. And Tolkien did write allegory. His short works, Smith of Wotton Major is an allegory, and he identifies it as such. And his story, Leaf by Niggle, great story, is also an allegory, and he identifies it as such. So we should take with a grain of salt his declaration, no allegory, because he just really, what he was reacting against, and this is the specific context of that comment. That context for that comment was people trying to put an allegorical reading on the Lord of the Rings and to say, oh, it's really an allegory for the nuclear bomb. And Tolkien just sort of threw up his hands in despair and said, no, it's not. So there's that. And then in terms of the writing of the Lord of the Rings, Tolkien actually wrote in a letter, he said, the Lord of the Rings is a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously in the writing and consciously in the revision. It's a deliberately Christian book. And in fact, the reason that there are no references to God or prayer or any religious observance in the book, he took them out specifically to make it more fundamentally Christian, because he wanted it to reflect the truth. He couldn't have false worship in his book if it was really a fundamentally true book. So he actually deliberately removes any invented religions, so that we can kind of imagine these people as kind of pre-Christian, moving toward the truth. And so we're more able to see the Christ figures, because multiple Christ figures. Frodo's a Christ figure in his sacrificial journey. Aragorn is a Christ figure in his kingly nature. Gandalf is a Christ figure as well. So there's various Christ figures that we see more clearly because he doesn't put in religious elements. So yeah, The Lord of the Rings is a deeply and fundamentally and deliberately Christian book.
Speaking specifically to the impact of Lewis, my daughter Caspian is here tonight. My other daughter Schaefer, named after Francis Schaefer, we've discussed at length. Schaefer thought that one of the most disingenuous things a Christian could do is to romanticize Christianity. That in its presentation, it's only about goosebumps and giggles and grace, and you just ask, and Santa Jesus gives you everything you want. You wrote really well in addressing the integrated poetry you read. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, and I think, this comes back to what I said at the beginning about the impact of Lewis and Tolkien and the fact that their vision has both dark and light in it, because that's true. And we need to not be afraid to say that that's true. Now, one of the poets that was most instrumental in my becoming a Christian, and has really been instrumental in the development of my faith, is Gerard Manley Hopkins. He's a Victorian poet, late 19th century, really great poet. Very difficult, but really great poet. And Hopkins wrote a lot of poetry. Some of it's very upbeat. But he wrote a set of sonnets that are called the terrible sonnets. And they're not called terrible because they're bad. They're called terrible because they're really bleak. Because Hopkins suffered from depression throughout his life. And he also had, frankly, a really rough life. He was frequently ill. He was estranged from his family. They rejected him when he became a Catholic. And he was struggling with his work. He wasn't able to get his poetry published. He just had a rough life, and he struggled with depression. And he expresses it really profoundly in these sonnets, and he conveys his great pain and his suffering, and he cries out to God, and he really just puts it all out there. And one of the things I learned from Hopkins is that God is big enough to hear that. God is not afraid of us being angry or doubting or hurting. He can cope with it. And so Hopkins's language of suffering really helped me to see that there's a place for that, and that I don't have to be afraid of my own woundedness and my own need. And I can cry out to God, because all of Hopkins' poetry, he just really puts it out there, but it's undergirded by a profound faith. He's got this faith that coexists with his own questioning of, why are you doing this to me, Lord? And that's a really powerful lesson, I think, for us to be able to see, again, that integration, right? And I think, going on what you were saying, it helps us to paint, a more well-rounded picture. Because honestly, it's a lie to say that if you become a Christian, your life is going to get better immediately. It's just not true. Now, every now and then there's somebody whose life does get dramatically better immediately. And certainly everybody's life is infinitely better in the long run. But in the short run, you know what? Like, look at the Christians who are dying in the Middle East. Their lives are not being made better in this world because they know Jesus. They're dying as martyrs because they know Jesus. In America, we haven't had martyrdom. And I think sometimes we forget, what the cost is to be a Christian. And I think it's helpful to think about that and to say, yeah, this can be hard. But even now, I think we're going into a time when Christians, we have to be ready, for instance, to lose our jobs for holding to Christian belief. To say, no, I will not. If the law says that my insurance coverage has to pay for abortions and contraception against my religious belief, I will not, and accept the consequences of it. If the law says you have to officiate at a same-sex wedding or lose your job, well, then we have to be willing to lose our jobs. And I think we have to recognize that in the short run is going to make our life harder. And certainly in the eyes of the world, and becoming a Christian, and I, as know, because as I mentioned in my book, I became a Christian as an adult. And you know what? It's hard to be a Christian because there's a lot of things that have to change in your life. And when you're used to things going a certain way, it's really hard. When you're used to being the one in charge, it is really hard to say, not my will, but yours be done, and actually mean it. It's hard. And you know what? It doesn't stop being hard just because you've been following Christ for 2 years or 5 years or 10 years or 30 years. With God's help, it gets easier. But it's never going to be completely easy until, we're resurrected and we're completely healed, right? So I think we have to be ready for things just to be hard. And I think that actually allows us to have a better witness to people that we're trying to invite into the kingdom. Because then we can be honest. And we can say, you know what? If you become a Christian, if you choose to follow Christ, I can't promise you that things are going to get easier. In fact, they may get a lot harder in the short term. But in the long run, it's the best thing you'll ever do. So come and join us. And we'll support you as it gets difficult. And we'll walk with you, and we'll help you, and we'll disciple you, and we'll be with you. And that's what we need to be doing. And that's a true presentation. And again, people see through it. If we promise it's nothing but warm fuzzies, well, they can look at the lives of Christians and see, well, you know what? That's just not the case. So let's just be honest, and it's just much more attractive and more true.
Last question. I want to note Dr. Ordway brought a sign-up sheet. If you'd like to stay in contact with the work at HBU and Apologetics, please sign up here at front. Thank you so much for being here. How can we pray for you?
Oh, thank you. That's a great question. If you would please pray for the work that we do at HBU, for my colleagues and myself, and for our students, because spiritual warfare is a reality, and we as apologists teaching people how to serve Christ are on the front lines. And so I really would covet your prayers for our program, for our teaching, for our writing. I would be very grateful. Thank you.